Greetings, everyone. I'm Kathy Mira from Erwin Inc., and I'm pleased to introduce today's session, DM08, Why Conceptual Data Modeling Matters. Our speakers today are Roberta Hyland and Dan Daly from the National Student Clearinghouse, and Joe Maggi from Agilarc. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Hey, Joe, how about I just turn it right over to you now and you begin today's presentation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Erwin, for having me and National Student Clearinghouse. We're excited to talk about a passionate topic to us. So with that, I'm just going to jump right into the agenda. So we're going to talk about introducing the real world. One of the reasons I've been attendees to a lot of these types of sessions, but when we are able to talk about a real world situation, and maybe not a consultant like myself talking, but actual folks from an organization like NSC, I think it just makes it much more impactful. So we will talk about real world situations that we did in conjunction with NSC. We'll talk about modeling, why do it, what's the end game, et cetera, and then that a little bit of discussion around conceptual versus logical and the uses of those models, et cetera. As part of that, we're going to kind of jump out to the tool. We'll look at some of the models we actually created, some of the industry standard models that we started with, et cetera. Then we're very fortunate to have the CDO of National Student Clearinghouse with us, who will talk more about governance and her role and how the actual modeling process could help jumpstart different governance activities. We'll look at metadata and the kind of the bidirectionality of metadata in a modeling process, where as we understand new terms and concepts in the model, they go into our metadata repository, and as we define terms, they could then introduce new concepts to our model. So we'll hit that a bit. And then I think we'll end up with, when is it time to quit? How can you go too far? Can we start wasting time? So is there a law of diminishing returns in the modeling world? The other thing I'll quickly hit on this slide is that little picture, that little race car looking thing. So, the idea, I've always been kind of fascinated with concept cars. They always have these wild, new ways of looking at vehicles and so forth. So, and I thought there were some good analogies with conceptual model and the concept car. So with a concept car, typically you'd put your best and brightest minds in, let them just free rein it, really come up with some unique and innovative ideas, but unconstrained about production lines and marketing and mass media. They're just in there to come up with the cool, the most interesting thing they could come up with without this constraints of how we're going to do it. So I thought that was a good example, because we find ourselves as facilitators in a conceptual models of saying, hey, let's not worry about what the database is going to look like right now. Let's talk about business rules and how different entities relate in our environment. So I thought that was a good analogy, and it's a cool car, so I figured I'd throw it on our slide. So with that, Roberta is actually going to talk a little bit about the organization and her role, and we'll go from there. So Roberta?
Thank you. So my name is Roberta Hyland. I am the Clearinghouse's Chief Data Officer. The National Student Clearinghouse is actually a nonprofit mission-based organization. So you may not think of nonprofits having to do this type of work, but we work with enrollment data and other types of education data in order to help colleges and universities and the entire education community, including K-12, understand what's working, what's not working, and we also perform some back office processes for them. So we really are committed to education, and needless to say, in this day and age, data is extremely important. So the CDO role at the Clearinghouse is probably about 18 months old now. My prior experience has been in higher education and enrollment management, and also working with our research products. So this work that we've been doing with Agilarc is tremendously important, and we're happy to share it with you.
So with Agilarc, I've got a quick one-liner, but we're a small consulting company based here in Pittsburgh, but we really focus on the data space. My background being in modeling from the early 90s, back in worked in the DC area as the relational model was just coming out. And But we really, our kind of vision is organizations that really value data as a critical asset of their organization, and really how to fully utilize and realize the full potential of that. And as our name implies, we found some creative ways to use agile techniques to address specifics in the data space, whether it's in delivery or integration, et cetera. So that's AgileArc.
All right, and my name is Dan Daly. I joined National Student Clearinghouse about a year ago as the Senior Director of Enterprise Data Management. I have a background in data management, data governance, a lot in the banking and insurance industries. I had some prior experience with AgileArc. I've known Joe for a number of years. I've worked with him on a number of engagements very much like this, doing enterprise data modeling and dealing with industry standard models and things. So I was very happy to join the clearinghouse and to partner with Joe and Roberta and the other teams on our project. So our project, noted at the bottom there, the enterprise data management team that I lead, we again engaged AgileArc to establish a new enterprise data model for National Student Clearinghouse. Fortunately, we've got a passionate and very active chief data officer in Roberta, and so we, from day one, we partnered very closely with her and her team on executing this project and building out what we now have as a brand new blueprint for all of our data assets going into the future as we move into cloud-based technologies and things like that. So with this project, we now have, again, we've established this enterprise data platform for all that we do with data going into the future.
So I believe we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges of student data, and I'll turn it back over to Roberta to talk through some of those challenges.
Thank you very much. So when we were looking at the data that the clearinghouse holds on behalf of all the organizations that we work with, we realized that the world is evolving before even the COVID pandemic, and the diversity of educational opportunities and experiences, diversity of the type of organizations involved, creates a lot of challenges when you look at it through the lens of the data. So ultimately what we realized is that we needed to restructure the way that we look at our data instead of being very transactional, very service specific information, really to create that diverse picture of a lifelong learner that could move in and out of various different mechanisms and delivery of education. So that was our challenge. We also need to manage the disparate data that we receive from a whole variety of different parties that are involved in providing education. When you think about that, obviously you think about things like normal K-12 organizations, institutions, you think about colleges, universities, but now think about boot camps. Now think about organizations that grant badges. Think about community-based organizations that are actually providing social education services to individuals to help them get job training. So it's a lot of different information. Additionally, there's also the move to competency-based education and understanding not just that someone completed a course, that someone completed a degree, but what are the actual competencies that an individual has gained through those various experiences. Some of those experiences may even be through a job. So that is the type of data that we're looking at. It's, as you can see, the last bullet, it's very fragmented. So this is the challenge that we are facing, and this is the challenge that we used modeling as our starting point in order to determine our future state. So I'll turn it over to Dan to talk about the needs.
All right.
And actually, I'm going to just jump in there a bit, and because I think some of these needs that we'll discuss are really pervasive with our clients, whether it's energy, higher ed, and so forth. But the as Roberta was talking about, the the different challenges in their particular environment. We work with other higher ed, but they're usually just dealing with their data and trying to make sense of it. In this scenario, if you could think about, getting a feed from a Yale or a Penn State, and also getting it from, Montour High School or whatever, with all different underlying business rules of how that data might have come over. So now the opportunity to say, what are our business rules and how do we want to conform all this disparate data from disparate sources and in a conformed model? So that was the opportunity. And then saying, okay, how do we apply those business rules in physical environments to create solutions, data warehouse, et cetera. But also, I think that need of improving communication between those technical and non-technical stakeholders. And I think that the conceptual and logical model is a unique opportunity and maybe one of our few opportunities as technology advances to really start that communication. We've got, I think, some specific slides that will talk about that communication vehicle of the model itself. And Dan, did you want to jump in on some of the positives?
Absolutely. Lots of positives to talk about in this project. You don't always have some of these key things, and we're very fortunate at the Clearinghouse. Significant institutional knowledge of student and education data is a huge plus for what we've set out to do. We're very fortunate at the Clearinghouse to have, although we're a relatively small organization, we have about 300 employees. We have people that have been at the company for a long time and who are very passionate about what we do. And that institutional knowledge of our data and everything that goes into it and where it ends up and the outcomes that it produces has been really, really helpful from a data standpoint and to be able to model and manage the data. As I mentioned earlier, the commitment of our chief data officer from day one has really been fantastic. It's such a key role. I know that CDOs have been popping up kind of all over the last 5 to 10 years. It's still a relatively new space, still a lot of room for error, and but we've been really fortunate to have a great one and providing the leadership on the kinds of things that we need, getting the right people involved, knowing who knows what kind of ins and outs of the data that we need and things like that. So these things are very much very key to our success. And then industry standard models. I had some prior experience with other industry standard models, again, in banking and insurance, and I've seen the value of using those properly. And as you'll see on the next slide here, this is one of the things that we started off with. Joe, if you want to go ahead and flip down. As we set out, on this journey, we started looking at what are the industry standard models out there that we can work from. And this grid shows you just kind of a sampling. In education, there are lots and lots of industry standard models that have a number of different nuances to them. The Common Education Data Standards model was really the primary model that we used as our starting point. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. But there were actually a total of 40 education-related data models or standards that we discovered and referenced. And just to explain the grid a little bit, what we did in analyzing each of the models was looking at what are the education levels that each of them address, from pre-K up through higher ed and then into the workforce and the military. So knowing which models applied to which education levels was very helpful. And then as well as the subject areas, we're going to talk a little bit about selecting subject areas and where we started with learner identity and enrollment and degree. But just being able to map out, what these different standards and models referenced and how they had different perspectives on those was really helpful in our modeling efforts. We're going to dig into this a little deeper in a little bit.
Yeah, and I think this kind of definitely highlights some of the things Roberta spoke about, some of those unique challenges. So if you think about trying to put together a picture of an individual in their military training for their pre-K and secondary, and where that is a daunting data problem with plenty of master data management implications. So I think this gives a good sense of that challenge. But to the point of having industry people have already thought through this as a starting point was key, I think, to a lot of our success. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more about modeling. I'm sure there's a lot of folks who have on the call and in the sessions that spent their life doing models, but maybe some. But so I've for years that I've talked about why we model, and two things typically bubble up: to create databases, and maybe not as much to document consistent business rules. And I would say a lot of people create databases, don't even create data models, but I often say, if you've got a database, you've got a model. I could reverse engineer it and so forth. So whether you think about that model up front, you are still, someone in your organization is creating one if you do have databases. So, but again, if we do it to create databases or document, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive goals. And so, I kind of contend, can you do one without the other? Can you really create databases without knowing your underlying business rules? And also, can you do models that are never intended to become databases, and are those beneficial? And I think both of those are the case. If you think about late in the development process, if we're creating ETL code, or we're creating a new application, or just putting data structures together, the questions about those business rules are going to come up. Can you be a customer without placing at least one order? All those sort of things that late in a development cycle, when it becomes very expensive to uncover those rules, here, while we're drawing lines and boxes in a conceptual and logical data model, it's less expensive, and you have more opportunity to get timely answers to those, which then can feed that development process. And even worse, if you don't uncover it in the development process, those rules can obviously create huge problems in the data quality itself. So as we start to look at our data after months of using a new system, we say, why do we have all these customers that don't have any orders? Well, no one ever defined that rule, and therefore it was never enforced in lower levels of our physical implementation. So again, I contend that, can you have one without the other? And but really, a means to the end. I mentioned data quality. That's really what all this leads to. If we want good, timely, quality data, where does modeling fit in? And we'll talk again later about the potential diminishing returns of modeling efforts. But with that, I also mentioned, as part of when we're going through the agenda, this unique opportunity to use a conceptual model to communicate conceptually, and finding that common language to communicate concepts. And what one of the definitions I've always liked to use of a data model was, the unambiguous documentation of business rules. So it's unambiguous if we use, and I'll jump down a few bullets here, a standard notation, and the criticality of saying, if we're going to draw lines and boxes, everybody, whether they're stewards or in analytics or an ETL developer, better understand what that notation is. A hollow diamond at the end of a box means something. A solid black dot has meaning. A circle with a line under it has a very specific meaning. And if you're not going to invest in that training and use of a notation, the value of modeling diminishes very, very rapidly, because it no longer becomes unambiguous. And the standard notation, which tools like Erwin support several, really hone in and make that unambiguous, and allows a facilitator like myself to probe those questions, and we'll see some of that in the examples. So we have those those business concepts, but it's really how those concepts relate to one another that creates a business rule. So can a student be a student without providing a piece of identification, and is that a positive and required relationship? And all those sort of little pieces. We know there's a relationship between student and different identification types, but what are some of those, like I said, more nuanced business rules? And fleshing those out while we're drawing lines and boxes has great advantage and is much more cost effective, I'd also contend. But now we've got that conceptual model that can be the sheet of music that everyone, whether again I'm developing ETL code or I'm creating a new data structure, etc., I have agreement because I've got that standard notation model that, again, if we do our jobs properly, should be ambiguous to any consumer of that model.
Hey, Joe, if I could add you can stay there, but a quick comment on the modeling notation and how critical that is. One of the things that hit me as we were preparing for this session that kind of I found a little humorous, but also I think telling as well. You know, for all of the enterprise data modeling engagements that I've done with Joe and his team and Roberta here at the Clearinghouse, every single one of these engagements, I realized we had the same pattern. Whereas as we started gathering the data stewards, people from the business and technology to work on this enterprise data modeling effort, I guarantee in every one of those cases, if we would have come out day one saying, hey, we need to train everybody on database modeling notation, and we're going to need you to understand it and apply it, I'm sure their eyes would have glazed over. They would have not been so interested. And we never did that. But what we did is we started talking to them about our business and our business nouns and the relationships. And as a result, started doing, the data modeling diagrams and the notation. And in every case, and this is what struck me as funny as I remembered it, it was the business folks that came forward and said, hey, can we standardize what we're talking about here with this notation? Like they got into the circles and the half moons and what they meant. And they actually asked us data management people to formalize that as a standard, as a document, because they saw how helpful that is in documenting their business rules and things like that. And so we did it in every case, and it's always a valuable part of the deliverables. I just wanted to call that out.
I'd agree, and I think I've seen that as a recurrent thing. But as you mentioned, Dan, go in and say, okay, we're going to spend the next 2 days talking about data modeling, notation, whatever. It's really getting in there, talking about some things that are close, near and dear to their hearts, and then seeing how the notation can actually help them communicate without saying, hey, go write me 50 pages of documentation on how a learner and a credential relate to one another. Here, we could draw a few lines and boxes, and bam, they've got that clear, and it could live on. That knowledge of our business can now live on in a graphical representation of those rules. So the process we started, or we worked with, as Dan had mentioned, and we saw some lists of some of those industry standard models. We'll kind of take a look at some of those as we go, which then helped us derive a straw man. So the modeling, sub-team combed through those models, said, we think this SEDS model that we'll look at is a little closer to what we think we might do. So, but let's not deal with all of it. Let's take out some chunks of that model that now we could go ahead and put in front of some of our business stakeholders. And that was the process of deriving that straw man model, which again, it's all about identifying those nouns of the business. And we could start with a whiteboard empty and just say, okay, tell me about your concepts and your nouns. Not probably the best way to start a conceptual modeling process. So that little blurb to the lower right, where we see some relationships between awards and credentials and credential issuers. And there might be a many-to-many relationship between a credential and an issuer. There's again a lot of discussion that would go into that we don't want credential issuers could have many credentials, but we want those credentials to be standard across all of our issuers, rather than have to come up for every issuer that we have to have a new list of credentials. So those are the little things that come out in these sessions that ultimately lead to better data. If I have to recreate a list of credentials every time I have a new issuer, then the opportunity for that data to become redundant and out of sync is high. So again, the master data management implications of this become very important as we're talking about some of those business entities. But I'll throw it over to Roberta to talk a little bit about the nouns that we were concerned about in our subject areas.
Yeah, early on, we looked at it as what is the most foundational piece of data or noun that unifies all the work that we do at the clearinghouse. And ultimately, that is the learner or the student. Really, we're trying to switch to learner because student is too tied to traditional education. And so when you look at a learner, the other thing that you could do is look at those things which specifically define the individual learner. And so that's where we started modeling, because not only is that the core importance of everything we do, it was also a way to have something very defined or finite, if you would, to help people learn modeling. Many of the people that we were involving in this process were, I would say, business analysts, maybe product managers, as well as operational people, in addition to the CDO, of course, and enterprise data management. But this way, it was something that they could relate to, something that they had a decent understanding of, and we could have very good conversations about what we're doing today, what works with what we're doing today, what we'd like to improve upon, and what we see coming for the future. So it really created a strong foundation for us to deal with that one noun, frankly, and then move into the more complicated areas like really what is a credential, because that terminology can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Right, and if I could just follow up on what Roberta had said, that learner or student, if we're a 4-year college, student might just be fine. But in this world, where a learner could be, we're tracking K-12 and all different types of learners throughout their entire lifetime. That definition of a student that we might have found in our industry standard model now needed to be made more specific to make sense in the NSC, the National Student Clearinghouse world. So yeah, it's looking at what we have access to, but how does it fit into our world that may not be in a traditional higher education scenario. So this is a slide that we use basically as Dan talked about. We thought we needed something to paint the big picture for folks. If we're going to ask you to come to these modeling sessions, a couple times a week or whatever, we want to give you a sense of, again, what that end game really is. So we're all about trying to get that, that enterprise model. So we might look at some reverse engineered systems that already exist at NSC, take a look at how their nouns and entities relate to one another, and are those business rules still relevant as we kind of move forward. And in the middle left, you see the industry standards is the SEDS model, the SIF model, and using that as an input to that straw man model, and also just doing some back of the envelope conceptual models to add into that. Now the help, and you see this is all under the umbrella in that gray box of data governance. This is where having a CDO and Roberta to say, okay, guys, yes, we see where all these different entities from these different sources could come from, but this is why it makes sense to start with learner as a subject area versus credential. Because of that hub, everything flows. Once we understand the nuance between our different learner types, then we could tackle things like enrollment or credential, et cetera. But all those go into a larger connected enterprise model that now becomes that sheet of music. So if we've got data warehouse developers and ETL coders, et cetera, they're all deriving their business rules from that single sheet of music, that picture of the enterprise data model. And again, whether it's data warehousing, master data management, or just new application development. So this was kind of our go-to slide. And the other thing we wanted to get across was, to educating non-technical folks in what we were doing here was this relationship between our metadata repository to say, as we're modeling, we should be feeding definitions from our model and new terms to our metadata repository. But as our stewards are defining those there, then we should be pushing those back up and say, have we just identified a new concept that we now need to bring into our straw man and kind of iteratively loop through that? So that those ties to metadata, I think, are critical, and getting people geared up for their role as being metadata definers was an important part of that. So having that starting point and saying, okay, we're going to look at models, but let's see where these models fit into the bigger picture.
So
how we use the tools. Yep, Go ahead, Dan.
I wanted to comment one last thing on that, on the previous one. Another, one of the details here that often gets overlooked that is extremely valuable is the reverse engineering existing data assets. So Joe touched on this briefly earlier by making the point that if you have a database or any kind of data store, you already have a data model. So this is where I've seen a number of organizations that haven't purposefully done data modeling or data architecture, but they've got all kinds of databases and data assets. And so taking some of those systems, in some cases that have been around for decades, and reverse engineering and showing what those structures are has been extremely helpful in that, you know, you can show sometimes in black and white why you have data quality issues. And it's because of this database that's been built over years with other people adding on, where they end up coding conflicting rules and scripts and structures. And so that reverse engineering exercise is always really critical in my experience. And when you're setting, you know, setting the stage for your new enterprise data model, for people to understand what's there and where some of the skeletons are buried, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in, and that's why it's extremely important that the business or the operational staff that knows that the processes inside and out are involved, because you need that reverse engineering. You need that understanding of the complex as is, so that you just don't repeat any workarounds or institutional band-aids that may exist, because you want to end up with the best future state possible, and your business people are the ones that can help inform that.
Right. Yeah, we had some great, and I was always impressed at NSC, the longevity of some of the folks who've been there for a while and had a lot of that institute. So they were the de facto stewards. Roberta converting them into actual formal stewards was critical to move through that process. But I'll comment on what was mentioned about reverse engineering. It's almost low-hanging fruit for consultants like myself who do that, to say, I could reverse engineer a model and say, I bet you have data quality issues with this. Just the way those things are associated or not associated with one another, it will oftentimes, you know, say, are you having some issues with energy consumption totals, you know, just based on what I might have seen in the reverse engineered model. So it's a great point. So with that, we did use Erwin Data Modeler heavily, both for reverse engineering of, and in this case, the industry standard models, as well as some internal systems. We also used it for conceptual modeling, and also these features like complete compare, to be able to say, okay, I've done some things with my industry standard model. How do I suck some of those artifacts into my enterprise data model for NSC, and using complete compare? So we're going to now kind of jump out and take a look at some of the models we created, as well as some of the industry standard models and how we started those straw men. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the actual models that we worked with. And so this is the, as we've been talking about, this SEDS model that was an industry standard. Again, the other nice thing in the higher ed space, a lot of these models were freeware, but very complex. As you kind of, you know, as I kind of scroll down through here, a lot of entities, a lot of relationships. So a great wealth of potential business rules that we could leverage, but the complexity of trying to migrate through those lines was daunting. So we took the technique of saying, okay, let's create some subject areas to get this more manageable. So I'm just going to go through a little exercise of how we kind of went about that. So our little example here would be to say, you know what, we're starting to see we need to capture some data around students and their allergies. So is there any industry standards around, you know, tracking student allergies, et cetera? So I'm going to create, and I know they're in there. So I'm creating a new subject area. We'll call it allergy, and we'll go ahead and in that allergy subject area, bring up some properties. And so on the left are all the SED data entities that we have that we could bring in. So those hundreds of boxes and associated lines that we saw. So I'm just going to scroll through and say, do I see anything in here that might give me a sense of allergies? There's other ways to do this, but this is one way. So I'm going to look, and I think there was one that was the person allergy. You see there's things around person military. So great. So there it is. So personality. So to create a subject area, I want to see what it's associated with. I want to see parents of that entity or table, and I want to see children of that. So a lot of folks, this feature, it used to be called in Erwin the spanning neighborhood, but this little button is very helpful in creating subject areas when you know you have something like personality and say, how in the world does that relate to other entities in this model? So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and say, give me one level of the parents to personality, and maybe give me one level of its children. So I could do 2 or whatever, but I'm just going to start there and see what it comes back. So I'll say add. So it does bring back some additional entities. Now we have the allergy severity, as in their notation in the SEDS model, they called it a reference table. So right away, that's a clue. Maybe we've got an opportunity to master allergy severities or allergy types. We have a reference entity called allergy type. And we also have the person. So all these were brought in by knowing those underlying relationships to the person allergy entity. So now I could kind of draw that up. And now, I've brought those in the subject area, but now, as many of you I'm sure know, I've got to go in and bring those into my diagram itself. So I'm going to bring all those entities that were brought together based on that spanning neighborhood of related entities. And now I've got something interesting I could start to talk to potential business people about. So I'm going to go in and let's kind of redraw that a bit. Maybe we'll choose orthogonal. So that's a pretty clear picture. Maybe I'll zoom in on a few of these that are a little more interesting. I'm going to take these shadows off of the display real quick. Makes it a little easier to read. So hopefully folks can see this okay. But I want to hone in on a few interesting things. So persons could have many personalities, which basically relates allergy types, so peanuts, dairy, etc., to a person. So now it's almost a many between allergy types and persons that we use this personality. So that's telling me something about their concept of that people could have many allergies and allergies could be associated with many people. But I think this one for severity is particularly interesting in the way, and again, I didn't model this just came straight out of the box. But if you notice, and this goes to that nuance of modeling that we could start to ask folks of. So they have an allergy severity entity. So this might be very severe, deadly, whatever, but that would be that domain list of severities. And they're saying that one severity could be associated with many personalities. So if Jane Smith is associated with a peanut allergy, we could also tie in the severity of that allergy for Jane Smith by using that. And again, great opportunity to say, maybe we should master these allergy severities across the organization and bring that into our MDM. But I do want to call out this little hollow diamond. So this is the IDEF1X notation. Apologize if folks aren't, a lot of folks will use the crow's feet notation, but that black dot is saying 0, 1, or many. And that little hollow diamond is actually an optional parent. It's saying that not every personality needs to be tied to a severity. So that's the rule that said, okay? But in our world, we might say, you know what? Every single time we document a person with a peanut allergy, I must document its severity, even though SED suggested otherwise. Our world, so this is where we start to customize and throw out and that nuance of that one little line, the implications of that being an optional parent are significant. You know, and again, from a data quality, if I want to do a report of saying, give me a list of all females with peanut allergies and their related severity. Well, if that's optional, I might have half of those severities missed. So that becomes very important. So I could simply go in. Now I'm building my straw man to an enterprise data model. I don't agree with the industry standard model, so I'm going to go in and modify that relationship and saying, instead of allowing nulls in that situation, I'm going to say no nulls. It then takes that little hollow diamond away, and now I've fundamentally changed a potentially huge opportunity for data integrity problems because of now we're enforcing our rules. So even if I don't get that from a certain higher ed institution or from a particular K-12 organization, I could still say our rule requires severity, and here's how we're going to address the fact that they don't give us one. But hopefully everybody through that little small example could get a sense of the nuance that could be asked, starting with an industry standard, maybe disagreeing with the rule that they might have applied, and customizing our rules to meet our business needs. So I'm also going to go ahead and check, or we're going to pull up the enterprise model that we had kind of came together with, and it also kind of, I think, will introduce some concepts of when have we gone too far in this. So this particular subject area is the identification. So obviously, you know, learners might have one or more pieces of identification. Our rule is saying you must have at least one. All learners, that little P, again, nuance to that business rule is saying you must have at least one piece of identification. You could have more, but every learner must have at least one. And then we use subtyping to say, well, let's further break out, because I might have attributes of a government type of identification that's different than non-governmental. So I'm now creating a mutually exclusive subtype hierarchy to say these are our first breakouts, government versus non-governmental. And then saying, okay, now government could be further broken out into domestic or foreign. And you see how that changed. So now we might find that there are attributes about state domestic identification types that are different than federal. And even the types, so we have, you know, federal, valid federal identifications might be a visa or a passport, etc. But state has only state assigned or driver's license. So right away, I could look at this model. If I'm into the notation and we've gone through these exercises, it's very clear to me I can't have a federal driver's license because federal and state are mutually exclusive to one another. You can't be federal and state at the same time. You could also infer from that since a driver's license is a type of state, that you can then not have federal. So those are the exercises that we kind of went through to hone in on those business rules. The real, and I think I've got another quick, you know, when we talk about organizations and modeling of organizations, you see things like, you know, that subtyping theme of institutions can be broken down in either school or non-traditionals. We could have schools break into high schools or post-secondaries. But when you see things like a consortium, so this is now we're going to say, well, Montour High School or Our Lady of Sacred Heart High School has a relationship with Penn State and Yale. So that consortium becomes important. But if you notice, if we're going to have a consortium in the middle there, and I'll just hone in on that relationship, we're going to have a consortium. We must have at least one post-secondary organization, a Yale or a Harvard or whatever, to be part of that consortium. And similarly, if I'm going to have a consortium, I must have at least one high school with that. I might have many, but the fact I've drawn that P says every consortium must have one post-secondary and must have at least one high school. But also you'll notice that the consortium's an optional parent. So now I'm talking with my stewards and I'm saying, are there high schools that are never part of a consortium? Or, well, yeah, sure, you could have high schools that aren't part of. So now I'm saying, let's make that an optional relationship by creating that little hollow diamond on that consortium part. So I'm saying consortiums must have high schools, but not every high school has a consortium. So if I'm an ETL developer or a database designer, etc., now I've got rules around consortiums that might have gotten lost in the text of some spec document. Now I could pull up this picture, and if I know this notation, that's going to paint a very specific question. The other area we like to use, you know, the subtyping to flesh out some of these relationships, and I'll bounce over. So we'll further break out high schools as either public or private. Then we say, okay, only public high schools can have districts. So again, if I don't enforce that rule in code and ETL code, etc., I might have private high schools that I've inadvertently associated with districts. Now I've got something people could say, okay, if it's of type private, never associate a district. And not every public high school may have a district based on that optionality of the parent. And kind of just to round this out, you know, we further break down private as either Catholic or non-Catholic, Catholic schools have dioceses, but non-Catholics don't. So it really, the richness comes into when we're subtyping, what are the specific attributes of a subtype that might not exist? You know, public high schools might have attributes that privates don't, or vice versa, or relationships. Public high schools have districts, privates don't. And I'm now set up while I'm drawing lines and boxes to communicate that fast, to have that one sheet of music that either technical or non-technical people can relate to. And as Dan mentioned, as we're going through these exercises, people intuitively saw the value of graphically representing something that they might have to try to put, you know, 3 paragraphs together to describe. This is unambiguous, and again, it goes back to that notation. If we don't agree that a hollow diamond means optional, then, you know, if I make up my own notation, the rigor and usefulness of modeling, to me, again, diminishes very quickly. So another plug for standardization around the notation. So with that, I'm going to bounce back out to our presentation. We'll go out, and I'm actually going to ask Roberta to talk a little bit about how the modeling effort helps us get governance out of the gate and really jumpstart our stewardship and governance program.
Thank you. So one of the challenges I think with data governance is the fact that often it seems like it is policy-based and focused on what you can't do versus what you can do. And so sometimes getting the engagement of the business leadership or business users or operational staff can be a challenge. So in many respects, since we were going ahead and we were actually refreshing or reinvigorating our governance process, it gave us the opportunity to actually start practicing the governance, if you would, through the data modeling, rather than having cyclical meetings and just saying, well, you're now the data steward. This actually brought it to life, and that was extremely important. So we were lucky in the fact that we consciously decided to start small. In other words, we were not going to try and leverage all of the different pieces of a data governance process at one time, but focus in on those pieces of data that were particularly important to our processes. And once again, that gets to honing in on the learner. Thankfully, while examples like the students with allergies is a great example to help people relate to what we're doing, luckily we didn't have to deal with that data, but we could pick our subject areas and bring in our skilled owners and stewards that didn't even really think of themselves in that way, but also restructuring those stewards into, we actually use the terminology of a data domain, because learner is one of those things that it's bigger than a particular service. It's bigger than an actual particular product that we have. And so that spans across everything we do. So that's a little bit bigger for us than a data area. And once again, going through the modeling enabled the back and forth of the conversation and the understanding the as is, but also having all that conversation at the detail level, like Joe was describing, about what if this, is this true? And then in some respects, leveraging an organization like AgileArc that of course has the practical expertise in education that everyone has, because we've probably interacted with our education system, but they don't necessarily get into the weeds like we as users have a tendency to do. And so them posing the what ifs. So all those things were very important and enabled us to really get live activity in our governance process, and also ask those questions and make sure we're not creating any data silos. The world of the past involved a lot of data silos. We don't want data silos in the world of the future.
Great. And then we'll talk a little bit about the metadata that flowed out of that process. And I think Dan, you were going to speak to this a bit.
Sure, and this is just kind of bringing all of these things together, really, hopefully having listened to our story and what we've done. Hopefully this is obvious that none of these particular disciplines that we've talked about, from the modeling, the governance, the metadata output, none of those things are optional in our collective experience for a successful project. you can't have metadata, or I suppose you could have it, but you can't really get any value out of it. You couldn't use it to make any decisions without active and involved data stewards. We can't have data stewards without a good governance framework. Again, I'm sure that you could go and give somebody the title of a steward, but where you don't have that framework of here's the vision, here's what we're trying to do, here's how we're going to affect and decide on our data assets going forward. It just does not work. You need that component. And then again, last but certainly not least, you can't have a good active data governance program without the executive level commitment. So again, hopefully these things have been obvious through the presentation, but just to bring those home.
Right. And again, we see, the role, we probably maybe 10% of our, 10 to maybe 15% of our clients actually have gone the route of having a CDO, but it makes efforts, the prioritization of efforts, the assigning of data stewards, the keeping us on track and so forth have been critical in this engagement, and that role we all hope that we see more folks like Roberta take those leadership roles within organizations. So I think this may be our last slide in terms of diminishing returns. When to quit? When have we gone too far? Can you go too far? Can you waste time? I definitely think you can. And I know back in the 90s when relational models were just coming out, I had heard of projects, usually in Europe for whatever reason, that they would model logically for a year or more. And it's like, but by the end of that year, your whole business could have changed, et cetera. So yes, you can go too far. Our thing is not necessarily when to quit, but when is enough enough? When do you have enough about learner that I can now take that to the next step? And I might have to revisit some attributes about a learner or some new relationships, but do I have enough to take it to MDM and figure out what we want to master about a learner? And do I have enough to take to our data warehousing to start to answer interesting business questions about learners, et cetera? So it's not really quit, because I would contend that, you never really, your model is always evolving, new things, new data domains are being introduced and so forth. But, this concept of avoiding the rabbit hole. So we had, I think it might have been Dan's boss, who was always in the back of the room. And we did this all virtually, by the way. It worked out better. Most of my modeling sessions, you get people in the same room. And this was actually even pre-COVID, with folks at NSC being in different parts of the country. We did it all virtually. We'd have 3 or 4 people in different rooms, but worked out pretty well. But we'd have folks that would be saying, hey, Joe, you're about to go down a rabbit hole. You could see from some of those examples, when you start to subtype of subtype of subtype, and it was always good to have someone to be that voice of reason and say, okay, we've probably gone far enough on this. So avoiding those kind of rabbit holes in the logical modeling world is something I would consider. So so that is our last slide. I think we'll turn it back over to Erwin. So thanks again, Erwin, for having me and us. Again, thanks for especially to Roberta and Dan to kind of co-present on a topic that I feel passionate about.
Really interesting presentation. Thank you all so much. We have a little bit of time for some questions, and hopefully you're all agreeable as well to follow up with any additional questions received through the Q&A chat box, after the event. But first, how about this one? In addition to data modelers and the CDO, what other types of roles were involved in the enterprise data modeling projects?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about data stewards. So engaging those business data stewards was really important. Also data analysts, not necessarily the folks on the technical staff. We do need the data, the ETL coders and DBAs and things, but even on the business side, I think every organization has the data analyst role, people that they might not even consider themselves a data person. They're in a business process group, but they're the people that have been around a while and they know the data in and out. So those data analysts, those key people that you uncover as you talk through the different subject areas that were really key. Also product or service owners, depending on the nature of your organization. If you offer services products, the leaders of those and the executives that lead those, their vision and where they're going, that becomes really key information as you're building out a new data platform. You want to be able to support them, not just what they're trying to do in this project, but where they're going in 1 to 3 years. Lastly, other executives, we've talked a lot about the CDO role, but in our case, my manager, our chief technology officer, our chief information officer, other C-level folks, even our CEO is very interested in what we have going. So that support and those roles are really critical to an effort like this.
Makes sense. Thank you. Is the role of a data steward a full-time job?
I'll take that one. This is one of those things that research would tell you, yes, have a data steward with, and that be their only job. I would say practically, especially I would say in the nonprofit space, that's not going to happen. And so that obviously it presents some challenges, but it actually presents some opportunities. Because once again, when you have people that are embedded in the operations or embedded in the business, and they have a data steward responsibility, they're actively engaged in the day-to-day from a practical standpoint, and it gives them the opportunity to ask the what ifs, or how can I make this better? But I think what's underlying that's particularly important is the fact that it means from your organizational culture, especially around data, you need to encourage intellectual curiosity. So it definitely can be a full-time job, but I think it actually practically presents some challenges, but there's benefits of actually having it not be the only thing a person does.
Love that, especially a student clearinghouse being interested in intellectual curiosity there. Makes sense. Dan,
Yep.
Thank you so much for pulling, and Joe, thank you so much for pulling in Roberta. Your insights were very much appreciated. Thank you all. Up next, we still have our booths, I should say. So there are booths devoted to Evolve, data intelligence and data modeling, open for another hour plus. I do encourage you also to go to the networking lounge. Now is the time to seek out those Erwin key personnel that you maybe talk to on the phone from time to time, or our marketing organization will be manning the networking lounge as well. And your fellow attendees, right? It's time to network. In this COVID world, we need to use our fingers to communicate, unfortunately, but that's how it goes for now. A lot of people in the platform, so please take advantage of it. And lastly, be sure to check out IT Central Station. There are a host of reviews published by you, the users. So voice of customer is key. They really give in-depth reviews of products in action. And if you haven't used them for your own personal use when assessing solutions, also consider writing a review. We'd love it if you would represent. So if you are an existing Erwin customer, do stop by that booth and find out exactly how easy it is. They do all the heavy lifting to share your insights. You are the professionals on our solutions, and we really value your voice. So at this time, thank you again to our presenters, and this does conclude today's session. Thank you.